Conflict is Not Abuse is a book that's been making the rounds on and off leftist Twitter for a few years now. It's a book that's been frequently cited by a lot of people that were quite prominent during the golden age of BreadTube. You know, back in the before times. So when I had to take a longer drive this past fall, I loaded up the audiobook and decided to see what all the fuss was about. And while at the time I felt that the book was actually pretty helpful, the more I sat on it, the more I started having some pretty uncomfortable thoughts about it and what it was trying to do. So I'd like to do a quick video giving a super duper bird's eye synopsis of this book and the parts of it that I think hold up, and the parts of it that I think do not. And no, I won't be going in chronological order because it's been a while, this isn't a full book review, and also I do not care about the order of these ideas, but the ideas themselves. The central point of the book is about differentiating between abuse and conflict, which she often further specifies as normative conflict. As in, it's normal to fuss about what to do for dinner on some nights, no matter how much you love the other person. Siblings will squabble and coworkers have drama, and that's all okay. It's fine. That's just life. And I do agree that there is a distinction between conflict and abuse. The line that she draws here, I have serious issues with. The core claim of the book is that conflict is when both parties have comparable power over the other. Abuse is when there's a power imbalance, and the actions are malicious and done by the person with the power advantage. There are a handful of cases in which examining the power difference is useful, and sometimes even necessary to understanding a conflict and assigning fault. Consider how we assess protest, for example. All too often, people protesting or resisting injustice are framed as the aggressors themselves when what they are doing is self-defense. What they are doing is not the abuse, but resisting abuse coming their way. Stonewall, for example, was not the queer community abusing police officers, but them resisting abuse that had been lumped on them by the police for decades. But in many other cases, I feel that this framework falls apart very quickly when you acknowledge that power is multifaceted, and that your target being powerful or on equal footing as you doesn't make something not malicious. Stonewall, for example, was resistance to abuse. But the January 6th riots, which would be defined by the rules of this book as simple normative conflict, was in fact reactionaries trying to abuse everyone else. The insurrectionaries throwing a temper tantrum that they couldn't have their white supremacist ideas as deeply embedded as they want were abusers, even though they didn't have institutional power over the government. In fact, they were abusers because they were trying to seize power over other people that they did not have any rightful claim to. So, right from the get-go, I feel that the book's perspective is fundamentally flawed, which isn't to say that there's no decent food for thought in the book, but I very strongly dislike the main thesis. There's also a lot of stuff that I just found simply weird, particularly the detours that this book took into talking about how email doesn't convey emotions, and therefore leads to a lot of emotional miscommunication, and that instead, people should just pick up the phone. First off, okay, boomer. Second, as an autistic person, I actually first found a voice that I could convey myself properly with in the form of text. As someone who is undiagnosed all throughout my formative years, I was very alienated because I couldn't communicate gracefully to other people. But when I started playing online video games, the text-based medium of chat gave me a lot of time for my analytical side to compose what I wanted to say and make sure that my words matched my intentions in a way that I had never been able to do out loud or in person before. That became a stepping stone for me to become more confident in social situations generally. And then here comes this person implying that text-based minds of communication are bad, actually. Part of me wonders if this person also takes objection to snail mail and handwritten letters. But phones too have their own problems. Even FaceTime or webcam-facilitated socialization has its limitations, its upsides and downsides. So I thought that was a little weird. A weird hill, even. Switching gears to talk about the positives for a bit, I did actually appreciate how the author did make a point to clarify that she didn't speak for everyone, and she didn't intend to, that the intent of her writings is to try to exact some wisdom and nuance from various real-world experiences and conflicts. And there was a lot of astute observation about, for example, how a lot of abuse survivors, if they don't do the emotional labor required to unpack their trauma, can in turn exhibit similar forms of abuse or other maladaptive qualities. One of the phrases she used, to loosely paraphrase, was that often it was retribution misdirected onto an innocent person elsewhere in their life. This is something that I would like people to be more cognizant of, both so that we can all be a little more self-critical for when we are exhibiting abusive behaviors ourselves, and how we can train ourselves out of the beliefs and assumptions that led us to exhibit those behaviors. Most abusers do not realize that they are abusers, and most forms of abuse are learned. And there are two major truths about abuse and cycles of abuse that I would like to see more people inoculated against, because those misguided beliefs can make people do counterproductive things when interacting with survivors. Is that trials make you a better person, that being a survivor of abuse will improve your moral character. This is pretty damn false. A person's moral character is what kind of person they choose to be. The leading contributor to this fallacy, I think, is the just world fallacy, where it's simply comforting for us to believe that every storm cloud really does have a silver lining, but this can have two very negative effects. One of which being that it leads us to take abuse less seriously because we start seeing it as a rite of passage. And the other problem is that it fails to account for how trauma can result in unhealthy coping mechanisms. One of the most common examples is how trauma caused by poverty often leads people to be hoarders because they feel they cannot let go of anything, not even anything trivial, because what if they need it again and they don't have the money to replace it? If we don't understand the patterns of how trauma affects people's behavior, how can we possibly hope to break these cycles? Paradoxically, the other myth is that trauma makes you a bad person. And you might be saying to yourself, but CritFacts, didn't you just say that? No, I said that trauma can often result in unhealthy coping mechanisms. But the thing is, at the end of the day, everyone has a choice over their own actions, with arguable exceptions such as panic attacks. And even then, we have a reasonable expectation that this person will still act ethically, even if they aren't entirely in control of themselves. Similarly, learned behaviors can take a lot of effort to unlearn, but we are all still responsible to unlearn unhealthy and abusive behaviors that we pick up, regardless of whether we acquire them through trauma or if we just become complacent in our moral agency and responsibilities. Jesse Gender did an excellent video essay on how Joss Whedon became an abuser not through trauma, but through entitlement and hyperinflation of his ego. Similarly, there are lots of survivors of various traumas who have done the emotional work to unpack what happened to them and use those experiences to understand how to better help other people so as to spare them what we went through. I'm an abuse survivor myself, and I like to think that this is what I've done, but I don't get to be the judge of that. I do feel that this book gives enough examples to give a vibe of these very important lessons, though I'm not really sure that they were ever articulated in a way that I personally would have phrased it. But there's something a little bit more concerning about the book. The author shames people who make the decision to permanently cut ties with someone else, calling those who permanently close doors to other individuals childish, even. This I seriously take issue with, because it implies that there is some duty to remain vulnerable to abusers, and I wholeheartedly reject that. I do think it's noble to give people a second chance when you believe that they sincerely want to change. I believe it can be a positive and admirable act to help someone change if they sincerely want to, but there is no obligation, no moral duty. In the same way that it's considered brave to swim out to help someone who's drowning, but there's no expectation to, especially if you can't swim very well yourself. And what the author is essentially doing, in a very uncomfortable way for me, is asking her readers to put themselves at that risk without concern for their own emotional safety. She does offer some pretty reasonable suggestions for you if you do want to do that kind of thing, such as conditional boundaries. One of the examples being given was don't talk to me for a year, but after that we can try to reconcile, or don't call me until you're sober. And if you want to leave that door open, I do think that that can be a very healthy and good thing in many cases. But I also feel that putting an expectation of it is unfair, and arguably enables abusers more than it addresses abuse. And then there was a very strange section about HIV, with some good observations such as how criminalization of exposing other people to HIV resulted in less transparency of risk, but also mixed with some very strange victim blaming, or at least that's the vibe I got from it. There was a section that got pointed out as very uncomfortable, wherein the author talks about some kind of work function or something, and how one of her coworkers was flirty, and so she started sexually fantasizing about this person. Followed by lamenting about how hitting on a coworker could be misunderstood and create awkward situations. Awkward for the person doing the inappropriate flirting, not necessarily awkward for the person being hit on uncomfortably, of course. And after 8 months of letting my understanding of this book ferment like a fine egg, I have to wonder, what did I really like about this book when I first read it? After some introspection, I realized what it was. The reason I liked the book so much at the time was because it allowed me to quiet my internal conflict about who deserved to blame for what and why. I listened through the audiobook, give or take a year after the main events that some archaeologists might refer to as the fall of BreadTube. During that time, I was dealing with a lot of complicated feelings about a lot of influencers, and also about how I myself was being treated as an emerging influencer. I was having a very hard time reconciling the fact that people can simultaneously promote very true and important ideas, but also be negligent or even unconscionably cruel at other times. In particular, I was heartbroken by the downfall of Peter Coffin, whose work around 2019 and 2020 was very helpful to me in abandoning the remaining internalized flaws of neoliberalism that I had unconsciously accepted because of their prominence in mainstream discourse. I felt very much helped by Peter Coffin's work, and as a result, part of me did feel a kind of parasocial relationship to this creator. And so, I admit that I overlooked some red flags emerging, that they were ableist and attention-seeking. They would have incredibly compassionate video essays about how bigotry feeds into classism, which feeds into the justifying ideologies of capitalism, and the way they made this information accessible to me was impactful for my political trajectory, and for that I was, and even still am, grateful. I wanted to believe that the conflict between them and their audience wasn't abuse, but conflict. ContraPoints herself cited the book explicitly, even calling it very wise, bringing up a passage about how one of the unhealthy coping mechanisms that people can develop from being marginalized is hypervigilance. And I do still think that there is merit to that point, and that there is merit to the point that a deluge of criticism from individuals can have significant emotional power over an individual, no matter how influential that individual is. And in early 2021, I was rightfully called out because in petty arguments with transphobes, I would bring up racism as a direct corollary to transphobia, not realizing how disrespectful that is to people who continue to deal with racism in their everyday lives. This is a really shitty thing to do that a lot of white people think is okay, but it's really not. Not in the least of reasons because in the history of black liberation, there have been a lot of fair-weather allies who have talked about racism only as a way to further their own political goals. It's disrespectful because it sends a message to black people and other non-white people that their political struggles and their painful history is now just a tool for white people to use to deal with other kinds of bigots, even while racism continues to rage on. That's not an easy mistake to admit to doing, because once you realize how bad it is, you become ashamed to have been the kind of person who would do that. And even when someone makes the effort to unlearn these kinds of biases, the fact that I exhibited them in the first place burned a lot of bridges with people who I really respected. I felt hurt and punished. I felt attacked. And even though the call-out was necessary, and that has allowed me to course correct, I still felt treated unfairly in some of the details of how I was called out and how I was treated by certain people in the subsequent months. And in some of the call-outs, there was harassment and transphobia. There were manipulation tactics, such as exaggerating and making deceptive claims about exactly how bad my behavior was. Part of me was still seeking the comfort of believing that I wasn't so bad, or that the abuse I received made my actions less bad, retroactively, somehow. And so I sought out this book's comforting line that I couldn't have been an abuser because I didn't have institutional power. I was susceptible to the comforting lies that Peter Coffin, for example, was experiencing normative conflict with their audience, or that their audience even had a power advantage over them as an influencer by means of controlling their economic and mental well-being. But the more I sat on this, the more I realized that's just not how it works. And while I do think there are some useful examples, some insightful analyses, and a few decent case studies, I feel like the central idea of this book is seriously flawed, and would lead to some very, very bad expectations if that core bad idea reached widespread acceptance. There's also something more concerning about whether or not we overlook the flaws of our favorite YouTubers. Something that's been popping up with other content creators, one whose name starts with a V and one whose head starts with a shoe, but also with culture and policy in general. The past few months, we've seen a disproportionate amount of public spectacle around the case of Johnny Depp and Amber Heard. Two very wealthy celebrities who have been battling in court over Heard supposedly defaming Depp when she talked about her own abuse, without even naming him specifically. Now, this is a very complicated case with a lot of information that is highly contested, to put it gently, but there's a dynamic here that I think's very relevant and needs to be commented on because I'm growing pessimistic as to whether or not people are actually learning the things they need to from this whole spectacle. One of the most problematic tropes that I'm seeing in people's responses is the whole bitches be lying thing. There's a massive problem in our culture of simultaneously consciously acknowledging that abuse is bad, but also constantly running apology for people accused of being abusers. Fundamentally, in my opinion, Rape culture is when we care more about the accused than we care about the abused. Trying to parse through information on this case is extremely difficult, but it does look like Johnny Depp has been abusive to Amber Heard and other people in the past. There are absolutely components to the case that Johnny Depp does not contest that are rock-solid evidence of abusive attitudes, such as text messages where he referred to Amber by really homophobic and degrading insults. But a lot of people are getting hung up on the truthfulness of each and every one of Amber Heard's claims, and insisting that any dishonesty on her part, perceived or otherwise, is indicative that she is manipulating the court system for personal gain, and therefore Johnny Depp is completely exonerated of any abusive conduct whatsoever. What this boils down to, in my eyes, is people using motivated reasoning, just like I did with Peter Coffin until I realized what I was doing, to try to pretend that their problematic favorite, Captain Jack Scissorhands, whatever, is not actually an abuser. And this is where it gets complicated, because whether or not Amber Heard is retaliating unethically is irrelevant to whether or not he is an abuser. Even if she is lying about some of the things he did, it does not erase the fact that Depp has an established history of abuse. And even if her hostility to him exceeds what could be reasonably called self-defense, it does not erase that he was abusive to her. There are some things that in this very specific case, I do wish people would take into consideration with a bit more weight. In particular, how much the dynamic was instigated by one person or the other. How much of the mistreatment between these two people was self-defense by the person with less power in this dynamic, and how much of it was just cruelty for the sake of cruelty. One very likely problem, especially given how convenient it was that Depp just happened to have recordings of the most incriminating things that Amber Heard said during their relationship, is that there may have been a significant amount of reactional abuse going on, which is when someone abuses someone else until that person lashes out, and then the lashing out is removed from the context of the abuse that provoked it, and used as evidence that the retaliator was the real abuser all along. We see this at the societal level with how people react to BLM protests, calling them unruly riots, while ignoring the fact that society was, and still is, structured to disproportionately protect some people's rights and be complicit in the harm of others. How dare they burn down the Target superstore that was funneling money into the institution that's murdering people? If you didn't want to be murdered, you shouldn't have been accused of using a counterfeit $20 bill, something no poor person has ever resorted to in order to survive in a world that would let them starve if they didn't have access to money, something that a discriminatory job market denies to all too many. And to bring it back to this very particular court case, given the evidence that Johnny Depp is an abuser, and I'm very confident in making that claim given all of the evidence that I've seen so far, I basically thought it would be impossible for somebody to make a video claiming that Amber Heard was at all culpable here. But I will give credit to what's-his-name from Re-Education, because while he does come out swinging with the hot take that Amber Heard is lying, he tempers it with the acknowledgement that he's coming at this purely from a personal reading of the details of the case, and then goes on to talk about how it's much more important to analyze the system in which this exists, pointing out that the real danger here is that a sample size of 1 might be used to disproportionately swing policy and cultural attitudes away from victims generally. He actually does some very insightful discussion about how, regardless of the details of this case in particular, there's a very real problem of people being abused just not being taken seriously, and how most people who are abused are not millionaires in Hollywood who can just up and leave and buy a new fucking house on a whim to get away from their abuser. Abuse victims in general are not taken seriously enough in this country and culture. And I would also like to recommend a very important video by Khadija Mbo about the ideal victim, and how the closer someone is to this ideal victim, a dainty white cisgender woman, the more likely they are to be taken seriously, whereas the farther someone is from that ideal image of a victim, the less likely they're able to be taken seriously, or even sympathized with at all, even if they are believed or proved to be telling the truth. Re-Education goes on to say that basically any system of accountability will be exploited, or at least someone will attempt to exploit it for personal gain or out of malice. But that should never be given more weight than the reason we have the systems of accountability in the first place. And to bring it back to this book, I'm seeing a similar failure in the book, in the discourse, and just in general to acknowledge how abuse is complicated, how power can be multifaceted, and how two people can be advantaged against each other on different axes. Amber Heard has ideal victimhood status because she's a rich, dainty white woman, but Johnny Depp has male privilege, has the cultural inertia of men failed by the justice system all pulling for him regardless of his actual culpability, how they're both rich and therefore neither of their situations is reflective of the wider patterns of abuse that we see generally. I saw very little analysis of how material conditions can make certain people more vulnerable to certain kinds of abuse, and little to nothing on how we can implement on any level any kind of real accountability. Because after sitting on that book for long enough, the ultimate vibe that I got was just that we should kind of shrug and stand by when abuse happens. On more than one occasion, I've had to retract tweets or endorsements of people because I found out that those individuals have been abusive in the past, including sometimes to members of the team. And I don't feel that this book is giving me any useful information in my constant struggle to figure out how do we balance forgiveness for people's fuck-ups with protecting the people that they have or might abuse in the future. How do we hold people accountable in a way that's fair to them, fair to the people they abuse, and that both allows us to prioritize the protection of those at risk with the growth and continued contributions of people who have done wrong, even indefensibly so? Looking back, I feel that most of this book was just wishy-washy platitudes and apologia for the wrong people, sprinkled with a few motes of wisdom from lived experiences, but that you could probably get better from elsewhere. I do still think it's worth giving a read if you have a lot of free time to read stuff like this, and are confident in your ability to critically analyze ideas as you are presented with them. But if you have a hard time doing that before you start subconsciously processing and accepting ideas, maybe practice your analysis skills a little bit first before giving this one a read. And I'm giving this one a 2 out of 10!